Chapter 19. Jonathan Harker's Journal. 1st October, 5 a.m. I went with the party to search with an easy mind, for I think I never saw Mina so absolutely strong and well. I'm so glad that she consented to hold back and let us men do the work. Somehow it was a dread to me that she was in this fearful business at all. But now that her work is done, and that is due to her energy and the brains and foresight that the whole story is put together in such a way that every point tells, she may well feel that her part is finished, and that she can henceforth leave the rest to us. We were, I think, all a little upset by the scene with Mr. Renfield. When we came away from his room, we were silent till we got back to the study. Then Mr. Morris said to Dr. Seward, "Say, Jack, if that man wasn't attempting to bluff, he was about the sanest lunatic I ever saw. I'm not sure I believe that he had some serious purpose, and if he had it was pretty rough on him not to get a chance. Lord Godalming and I were silent, but Dr. Van Helsing added, "Friend John, you know more of lunatics than I do, and I'm glad of it, for I fear that if it had been to Mina's side, I would before that last hysterical outburst have given him free. But we live and learn, and in our present task we must take no chance. As my friend Quincy would say, all is best as they are." Dr. Seward seemed to answer them both in a dreamy kind of way. "I don't know, but I agree with you. If that man had been an ordinary lunatic, I would have taken any chance of trusting him. But he seemed so mixed up with the Count that in an indexy kind of way that I am afraid of doing anything wrong by helping his fads. I can't forget how he prayed with almost equal fervor for a cat, and then tried to tear my throat out with his teeth. Besides, he called the Count Lord and Master, and he may want to get out to help him in some diabolical way. That horrid thing has the wolves and the rats and his own kind to help him, so I suppose he isn't above trying to use a respectable lunatic. He certainly did seem earnest, though. I only hope we have done what is best. These things, in conjunction with the work we have at hand, help to unnerve a man." The professor stepped over, and laying a hand on his shoulder, said in his grave, kindly voice, "Friend John, have no fear. We are trying to do our duty in a very sad and terrible case. We can only do as we deem best. What else have we to do and to hope for, except for the pity of the good God?" Lord Godalming had slipped away for a few minutes, but now he returned. He held up a little silver whistle as he remarked, "That old place is full of rats, and if so, I've got an antidote for all." Having passed the wall, he took our way to the house, taking care to keep in the shadows of the trees on the lawn when the moonlight shone out. When we got to the porch, the professor opened his bag and took out a few things, which he laid on the step, sorting them into 4 little groups, evidently one for each. Then he spoke. "My friends, we are going into a terrible danger, and we need arms of many kinds. Our enemy is not merely spiritual. Remember that he has the strength of 20 men, and that, though our necks or our windpipes are of the common kind, and therefore breakable or crushable, he is not amiable to mere strength. A stronger man, or a body of men more strong than him, can at certain times hold him, but yet they cannot hurt him as we can be hurt by him. We must, therefore, guard ourselves from his touch. Keep this near your heart." As he spoke, he lifted a little silver crucifix and held it out to me, I being nearest to him. "Put these flowers around your neck." Here he handed me a wreath of withered garlic blossoms. "For the enemies more mundane, this revolver and this knife, and for aid in all. These are so small electric lamps, which you can fasten to your breast, and for all and above in the last, this which we must not desecrate needless. This was a portion of sacred water, put it, in which he put an envelope and handed to me. Each of the others were similarly equipped. Now, he said, friend John, where are the skeleton keys? If so that we may open the door, we need not break the house by the window, as therefore at Miss Lucy's. Dr. Seward tried one or two skeleton keys, his mechanical dexterity as a surgeon standing him in good stead. Presently he got one to suit. After a little play back and forth, the bolt yielded, and with a rusty clang shot back. We pressed on the door. The rusty hinges creaked, and it opened slowly. It was startling, like a image conveyed to me in Dr. Seward's diary of the opening of Miss Westerina's tomb. I fancy that he had the same idea to strike as the others, for with a second they shrank back. The professor was the first to move forward, and stepped into the open door. In manus tuas domne, he said, crossing himself as he passed over the threshold. We closed the door behind us, lest when we should have lit our lamps we might possibly attract attention from the road. The professor carefully tried to lock it, in case we might not be able to open it from within should we be in a hurry to make our exit. Then we all lit our lamps, and proceeded on our search. The light from the tiny lamps fell in all sorts of odd forms, as rays crossed each other, or the opacity of our bodies threw great shadows. I could not for the life of me get away from the feeling that we were someone else amongst us. I suppose it was the recollection, so powerfully brought home to me by the grim surroundings, of that terrible experience in Transylvania. I think the feeling was common to us all, for I noticed that the others kept looking over their shoulders at every sound and every new shadow, just as I felt myself doing. The whole place was thick with dust. The floor was seemingly inches deep, except where there had been a few recent steps, in which the holding down of my lamp could see the marks of hobnails where the dust is caked. The walls were fluffy and heavy with dust, and in the corners were masses of spider webs, whereupon the dust had gathered till they looked like old tattered rags, as the weight had torn them down partly. On a table in the hall was a great bunch of keys, with a time-yellowed label on each. They had been used several times, for on the table were several similar rents in the blanket of dust. Like that exposed by the professor lifted the keys. He turned to me and said, You know this place, Jonathan. You have copied maps of it, and you know at least more than we do. Which way is the way to the chapel? I had an idea of the direction, though on my former visit I had not been able to get admission to it. So I led the way, and after a few more wrong turns, we found myself opposite the low, arched oaken door, ribbed with iron bands. This is the spot, said the professor, as we turned his lamp on the small map of the house, copied from the file of my original correspondence regarding the purchase. With a little trouble, we found the key on the bunch and opened the door. We were prepared for some unpleasantness, for as we were opening the door, a faint, malodorous air seemed to exhale through the gaps, but none of us ever expected such an odor as we encountered. None of the others had met the Count at all at close quarters, and when I had seen him he was either in the fasting stage of his existence or in his rooms, or when he was glutted with fresh blood in a ruined building open to the air. But here the place was small and close, and the long disuse had made the air stagnant and foul. There was an earthy smell, as some dry miasma, which came through the fouler air. But as to the odor itself, how shall I describe it? It was not alone that it was composed of all the ills of mortality, and with a pungent, acrid smell of blood, but it seemed as though corruption had become itself corrupt. Ugh, it sickens me to think of it. Every breath exhaled by that monster seemed to have clung to the place and intensified its loathsomeness. Under ordinary circumstances, such a stench would have brought me out of enterprise to an end. But this was no ordinary case, and the high and terrible purpose in which we were involved gave us a strength which rose above the merely physical considerations. After the involuntary shrinking of consequence on the first nauseous whiff, we one and all set about our work as though the loathsome place were a garden of roses. We made an accurate examination of the place, the professor saying as we began. The first thing is to see how many of the boxes are left. We must then examine every hole and corner and cranny, and see if we cannot get some clue as to what has become of the rest. A glance was sufficient to show how many remained, for the great earth chests were bulky, and there was no mistaking of them. There were only 29 left out of the 50. Once I got a fright for seeing Lord Godalming suddenly turn and look out of the vaulted door to the dark passage beyond. I looked too, and for an instant my heart stood still. Somewhere, looking out of the shadows, I seemed to see the highlights of the Count's evil face, the ridge of his nose, the red eyes, the red lips, the awful power. It was only a moment, for as Lord Godalming said, I thought I saw a face, but it was only the shadows, and resumed his inquiry. I turned my lamp in the direction and stepped into the passage. There was no sign of anyone, and there was no corners, no doors, no aperture of any kind, only but solid walls. Passage. There could be no hiding, even for him. I took it that the fear had helped imagination, and said nothing. A few minutes later, I saw Morris step suddenly back from a corner which he was examining. We all followed his nervousness with our eyes, for undoubtedly some nervousness was growing on us, and we saw a whole mass of phosphorescence, which twinkled like stars. We all instinctively drew back. The whole place was becoming alive with rats. For a moment or two we stood appalled, all save Lord Godalming, who was seemingly prepared for such an emergency, rushing over to the great iron-bound oaken door which Dr. Seward had described from the outside, and which I had seen myself. He turned the key in the lock, and drew the bolts, and swung the door open. Then, taking his little silver whistle from his pocket, he blew a shrill, low call. It was answered from behind Dr. Seward's house by the yelping of dogs, and after about a minute 3 terriers came dashing about the corner of the house. Unconsciously, we had all moved towards the door, and as we moved, I noticed that the dust had been disturbed. The boxes with which had been taken out brought this way. But even in the minute that had elapsed, the number of rats was vastly increased. They seemed to swarm all over the place at once, till lamplight shining on their working, moving bodies and glittering, baleful eyes made the place look like a bank of the earth set with fireflies. The dogs dashed on, but at the threshold suddenly stopped and snarled. Then, simultaneously lifting their noses, began to howl in a most lugubrious fashion. The rats were multiplying in thousands, and we moved out. Lord Godalming lifted one of the dogs, and carrying with him, placed him on the floor. The instant his feet touched the ground, he seemed to recover his courage, and rushed at his natural enemies. They fled before him so fast that, before he had shaken the life out of a score, the other dogs, who had now been lifted in the same manner, but had a small prey ere the whole mass had vanished. With their going, it seemed as if some evil presence had departed, for the dogs frisked about and barked merrily as they made sudden darts at the prostrate foes, and then turned them over and tossed them in the air with vicious shakes. We all seemed to find our spirits rise, whether it was the purifying of the deadly atmosphere by the opening of the chapel door, or the relief which we experienced at finding ourselves in the open, I know not. But most certainly the shadow of dread seemed to slip from us like a robe, and the occasion of our coming lost something had of its grim significance, though we did not slacken a whit in our resolution. We closed the outer door and barred and locked it, and bringing the dogs with us, began our search of the house. We found nothing throughout except dust in extraordinary proportions, and all untouched save for our own footsteps when I had made my first visit. Never once did the dogs exhibit any symptom of uneasiness, and even when we returned to the chapel they frisked about as though they had been rabbit hunting in a summer wood. The morning was quickening in the east when we emerged from the front. Dr. Van Helsing had taken the key to the hall door from his bunch and locked the door of the orthodox fashion, putting the key into the pocket when he had done so. "So far," he said, "our night has been eminently successful. No harm has come to us, such as I feared might, and yet we have ascertained how many boxes are missing. More than all, I do rejoice at this. Our first, and perhaps our most difficult and dangerous, step has been accomplished without bringing thereunto in our most Madam Mina, or troubling her waking or sleeping thoughts with sights and sounds and smells of horror, which she might never forget. One lesson, too, we have learned, if it be allowable to argue a particulari, that the brute beasts which are the Count's command are yet themselves not amiable to his spiritual powers. For look, these rats that would come to his call, just as from his castle atop the summon the wolves here, going to that poor mother's cry, though they have come to him, they run parallel from so little dogs of my friend Arthur. We have other matters before us, other dangers, other fears, and that monster. He has not used his power over the brute world for only or the last time tonight. So be it that he has gone elsewhere. Good. It has given us opportunity to cry check in some way in this chess game, which we play for the stake of human souls. And now let us go home. The dawn is close at hand, and we have reason to be content with our first night's work. It may be ordained that we have many nights and days to follow, if full of peril, but we must go on, and from no danger shall we shrink." The house was silent when we got back, save for some poor creature who was screaming away in the room of one of the distant wards, and a low, moaning sound from Renfield's room. The poor wretch was doubtless torturing himself, after the manner of insane, with needless thoughts of pain. I came tiptoe into our own room, and found Mina asleep, breathing so softly that I had put my ear down to hear it. She looks paler than usual. I hope that meeting tonight was not upsetting her. I am truly thankful that she is to be left out of our future work, and even of our deliberations. It is too great a strain for a woman to hear. I did not think at first, but I know better now. Therefore I am glad that it is settled. There may be things which would frighten her to hear, and yet to conceal them from her might be worse than to tell her, if once she suspected that there was any concealment. Henceforth our work is to be a sealed book to her, till at least such time as we can tell her that all is finished, and the earth free of the monster of the netherworld. I dare say it will be difficult to begin to keep silence after such confidence as ours, but I must be resolute, and tomorrow I shall keep dark over tonight's doings, and shall refuse to speak of anything that has happened. I rest on the sofa as to not disturb her. 1st October. Later. I suppose it was natural that we should have all overslept ourselves, for the day was a busy one, and the night had no rest at all. Even Mina must have felt its exhaustion, for though I slept till the sun was high, as I awake before her, and had to call 2 or 3 times before she awoke. Indeed, she was so sound asleep that for a few seconds she did not recognize me, but looked at me with a sort of blank terror, as one who has been waked from a bad dream. Well, she complained a little of being tired, and I let her rest till later in the day. We now know that 21 boxes have been removed, and if we be that several were taken away in any of these removals, we may be able to trace them all. Such will, of course, immensely simplify our labor, and the sooner the matter is attended to, the better. I shall look up Thomas Smelling today. Dr. Seward's Diary, 1st October. It was towards noon when I awakened by the professor walking into my room. He was more jolly and cheerful than usual, and it was quite evident that last night's work had helped to make some of the brooding weight off of his mind. After going over the adventure of the night, he suddenly said, "Your patient interests me much. May it be that with you I visit him this morning? Or if that you are too occupied, I can go alone if it may be. It is a new experience to find me a lunatic who will talk philosophy and reason so sound." I had some work to do which pressed, so I told him that if he would go alone I would be glad, as then I should not have to keep him waiting. So I called an attendant and gave him the necessary instructions. Before the professor left the room, I cautioned him against getting any false impression from my patient. "But," he answered, "I wanted to talk to him myself, and of his delusion as to the consuming of live things. He said to Mina, as I see in your diary from yesterday, that he had once had such a belief. Why do you smile, friend John?" "Excuse me," I said, "but the answer is here." I laid my hand on the typewritten matter. When our sane and learned lunatic made that very statement about how he used to consume life, his mouth was actually nauseous with the flies and spiders which he had just eaten before Miss Harker had entered the room. Van Helsing smiled in turn. "Good," he said. "Your memory is true, friend John. I should have remembered, and yet it is not very obliquity of thought and memory which makes my mental disease such a fascinating study. Perhaps I may gain some more knowledge out of the folly of this madman than I shall from teaching of the most wise. Who knows?" I went on with my work, and before long was through it that in hand. It seemed that the time had been very short indeed, but there was Van Helsing back in the study. "Do I interrupt?" he asked politely as he stood in the door. "Not at all," I answered. "Come in. My work is finished, and I am free. I can go with you now if you like." "It is needless. I have seen him." "Well?" "I fear that he does not appraise me much at all. Our interview was short. When I entered the room, he was sitting on a stool in the center, with his elbows on his knees, and his face was a picture of sullen discontent. I spoke to him as cheerfully as I could, and with such a measure of respect I could assume. He made no reply whatsoever. 'Don't you know me?' I asked. His answer was not reassuring. 'I know you well enough that you are old fool Van Helsing.' I wish you would take yourself and your idiotic brain theories elsewhere. Damn all thick-headed Dutchmen. Not a word more would he say, but sat in his implacable sulkiness as indifferent to me as though I had been in the room at all. Thus departed for the time my chance of much learning from so clever a lunatic. So I shall go, if I may, and cheer myself with a few happy words with the sweet soul Madam Mina, friend John. It does rejoice me unspeakable that she is no more to be pained, no more to be worried with our terrible things. Though we shall miss much her help, it is better so. I agree with you with all my heart, I answered earnestly, for I did not want him to weaken in this manner. Miss Harker is better out of it. Things are quite bad enough for us, all men of the world, and who have been in many tight places in our time, but it is no place for a woman, and if she had remained in touch with such an affair, it would in time infallibly have wrecked her. So Van Helsing has gone to confer with Mrs. Harker, and Harker, Quincy, and Art are both out following up on clues to the earth boxes. I shall finish my round of work, and we shall meet tonight. Mina Harker's journal. 1st October. It is strange to me to be kept in the dark as I am today, after Jonathan's full confidence for so many years, to see him manifestly avoid certain matters, and those the most vital of all. This morning I slept late after the fatigues of yesterday. Though Jonathan was late too, he was the earlier. He spoke to me before he went out, never more sweetly or tenderly, but he never mentioned word of what had happened in the visits to the Count's house. And yet he must have known how terribly anxious I was. Poor dear fellow! I suppose it must have distressed him even more than it did me. They all agreed that it was best that I should not be drawn further into this awful work, and I acquiesced. But to think that he keeps anything from me! And now I am crying like a silly fool, when I know it comes from my husband's great love and from the good wishes of those other stronger men. That had done me some good. Well, some day Jonathan will tell me all, and lest it should be that he should think for a moment that I kept anything from him, I still keep my journal as usual. Then, if he has doubted of my trust, I shall show it to him, with every thought my heart has put down for the dear eyes to read. I feel strangely sad and low-spirited today. I suppose it is some reaction to the terrible excitement. Last night I went to bed with the men gone, simply because they told me to. I didn't feel sleepy, but I did feel a devouring anxiety. I kept thinking over everything that has been since Jonathan came to see me in London, and it seems like a terrible tragedy, with fate pressing on relentlessly with some destined end. Everything that one does seems, no matter how right it may be, to bring on the very thing which is most deplored. If I had gone to Whitby, perhaps poor dear Lucy would now be with us. She hadn't taken to visiting the courtyard till I came, and if she hadn't come there in the daytime with me, she wouldn't have walked there in her sleep. And if she hadn't gone there in sleep in the night, the monster couldn't have destroyed her as he did. Oh, why did I ever go to Whitby? There now, crying again. I wonder what has come over me today. I must hide it from Jonathan, for if he knew that I had been crying twice in one morning, I, who never cried on my own account, and for whom he never caused to shed a tear, the dear fellow would fret his heart out. I shall put on a bold face, and if I do feel weepy, he shall never see it. I suppose it is one of the lessons that we poor women have to learn. I can't quite remember how I fell asleep last night. I remember hearing the sudden barkings of dogs and a queer lot of sounds, like praying in a very tumultuous rate from Mr. Renfield's room, which is somewhere under this. And then there was a silence of everything, silence so profound that it startled me. And I got up and looked out the window. All was dark and silent, the black shadows thrown by the moonlight seeming full of silent mystery of their own. Not a thing seemed to be stirring, but all to be grim and fixed as death or fate, so that a thin streak of white mist that crept almost imperceptible slowness across the grass towards the house seemed to have a sentience and a vitality of its own. I think that the digression of my thoughts must have done me good, for when I got back to bed I found lethargy creeping over me. I lay a while, but I could not quite sleep, so I got out and looked out of the window again. The mist was spreading and was now close up to the house, so that I could see it lying thick against the wall, as though it were stealing up to the windows. The poor man was loud as ever, and though I could not distinguish a word he said, I could in some part recognize that his tones and passionate entreaty in this part. Then there was a sound of a struggle, and I knew that the attendants were dealing with him. I was so frightened that I crept into bed and pulled the clothes over my head, putting my fingers in my ears. It was not till then that a bit sleepy. Or at least so I thought. But I must have fallen asleep, for except dreams, I did not remember anything until the morning, when Jonathan woke me. I think that it took me an effort and a little time to realize where I was, and that it was Jonathan who was bending over me. My dream was very peculiar, and was almost typical of the way of waking thoughts become merged in or continued in dreams. I thought that I was asleep and waiting for Jonathan to come back. I was very anxious about him, and I was powerless to act. My feet, my hands, my brain were weighed, so that nothing could proceed at the usual pace, and so I slept uneasy in thought. Then it began to dawn upon me that the air was very heavy and dank and cold. I put back the clothes about my face and found, to my surprise, that all was dim around me. The gaslight which I had lit for Jonathan was turned down, came only like a tiny red spark in the fog, which had evidently grown thicker and poured into the room. Then it occurred to me that I had shut the window before I came to bed. I would have got out to make certain at that point, but some leaden lethargy seemed to chain my limbs and even my own will. I lay still and endured. That was all. I closed my eyes, but could still see through my eyelids. It is wonderful what tricks our dreams to play us, and how conveniently we can imagine. The mist grew thicker and thicker, and I could see now how it came in, for I could see it like smoke, or with the white energy of boiling water, pouring in, though not through the window, but through the joinings of the door. I got thicker and thicker till it seemed as if it became concentrated into a sort of pillar of cloud in the room, through which the top of which I could see through the gas and lighting like a red eye. Things began to whirl through my brain just as the cloud column was now whirling through the room, and though it came from scriptural words, a pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night. Was that intended some spiritual guidance that was coming to me in my sleep? But the pillar was composed of both night and day, guiding, for the fire was in the red eye, which at the thought gave me a new fascination to me, till, as I looked, the fire divided, and seemed to shine on me through the fog like two red eyes, which Lucy told me of in her momentary mental wandering when, on the cliff, the dying sunlight struck the windows of St. Mary's Church. Suddenly the horror burst upon me that it was thus that Jonathan had seen the awful women growing into reality in the whirling mist and the moonlight, and it was my dream. I must have fainted, for all the darkness fell. The last conscious effort which imagination made was to show me a livid white face bending over me out of the mist. I must be careful of such dreams, for what would unseat one's reason if it were too much of them? I would get Dr. Van Helsing or Dr. Seward to prescribe something for me which would make me sleep, only that I fear to alarm them. Such a dream at the present time would become woven into the fears for me. Tonight I shall strive hard to sleep naturally. If I do not, I shall tomorrow night get them to give me a dose of chloral. That can hurt me once, and it will give me a good night's sleep. Last night tired me more than if I had not slept at all. 2nd October, 10 p.m. Last night I slept, but did not dream. I must have slept soundly, for I was not waked by Jonathan coming to bed, but the sleep has not refreshed me. For today I feel terribly weak and spiritless. I spent all yesterday trying to read or lying down dozing. In the afternoon Mr. Renfield asked if he might see me. Poor man, he was very gentle, and when I came away he kissed my hand and bade God bless me. Some way it affected me much. I'm crying when I think of him. This is a new weakness of which I must be careful. Jonathan would be miserable if he knew I had been crying. He and the others were out until dinner time, and they all came in tired. I did what I could to brighten them, and I suppose that effort did me good, for I forgot how tired I was. After dinner they sent me to bed, and all went off to smoke together, as they said. But I knew that they wanted to tell me and each other what occurred to each during the day. I could see from Jonathan's manner that he had something important to communicate. I was not so sleepy as I should have been, so before I went in I asked Dr. Seward to give me a little opiates of some kind, and I had not slept well the night before. He very kindly made me up a sleeping draught, which he gave me, telling me that it would do me no harm, as it was very mild. I have taken it, and am waiting to sleep, which still keeps aloof. I hope I am not done wrong, for as sleep begins to flirt with me, a new fear comes, that I may have been foolish in thus depriving myself of the power of waking. I might want it. Here comes sleep. Good night. Chapter 20. Jonathan Harker's Journal. 1st October, evening. I found Thomas sewing in the house at Belthrand Green, but was unhappy he was not in a condition to remember anything. The very prospect of beer, which my expected coming had opened to him, had proved too much, and he began too early on his expected debauch. I learned, however, from his wife, who seemed a decent, poor soul, that he was only an assistant to Smollett, who of the two mates was the responsible person. So I drove off to Walworth, and found Mr. Joseph Smollett at home, and his shirt sleeves taking a late tea out of a saucer. He is a decent and intelligent fellow, distinctly a good reliable type of workman, and with a headpiece of his own. He remembered all about the incident of the boxes from a wonderful dog-eared notebook, which he produced some mysterious receptacle about the seat of his trousers, and which had hieroglyphical entries in thick, half-obliterated pencil. He gave me the destinations of the boxes. There were, he said, 6 in a cartload which he took from Carfax and left at 197 Chicksand Street, Mile End, Newtown, and another 6 which he deposited at Jamaica Lane, Bermondsey. If then the Count meant to scatter these ghastly refuges over London, these places were chosen at the first of delivery, so that later he might distribute more fully. The systematic manner in which this was done made me think that he could not mean to confine himself to two sides of London. He was now fixed on the far east of the northern shore, and on the east of the northern shore, and on the south. The north and west were surely never meant to be left out of his diabolical scheme, let alone the city itself, and the very heart of fashionable London, the southwest and west. I went back to Smollett and asked him if he could tell us of any other boxes that had been taken from Carfax. He replied, "Well, governor, you treated me very well once, and I have given you half a sovereign, and I'll tell you all I know. I heard a man by the name of Bloxham say 4 nights ago, in the Iron and Hounds of the Pitcher's Alley, as how he and a mate had a rare dusty job of an old house in Burfleet. There ain't a many such jobs around here, and I'm thinking that maybe Sam Bloxham could be telling you something." I asked if he could tell me where to find him. I told him that if he could get me the address, it would be worth another half sovereign to him. So he gulped down the rest of his tea and stood up, saying that he was going to begin the search for them. And there. At the door he snapped and said, "Look here, governor. There ain't no sense in me a keeping you. I may find Sam soon, or I mayn't. But anyhow, he ain't like to be in the way of telling you much tonight. Sam is a rare one when he starts on the booze. If you can give him an envelope with a stamp on it and put your address on it, I'll find out that Sam is to be found and post it to you tonight. But you better be up and arter some in the morning, or you won't catch him. For Sam gets off early, and mind the booze the night before." This was all practical, so one of the children went off with a penny to buy an envelope and a sheet of paper, and to keep the change. When she came back, I addressed the envelope and stamped it, and when Smollett had again faithfully promised to post the address when found, I took my way to home. We're on the track anyhow, and I'm tired tonight and want to sleep. Mina is fast asleep, and looks a little too pale. Her eyes look as though she'd been crying. Poor dear. I've no doubt that frets her to be kept in the dark, and makes her doubly anxious about me and the others. But it is best as it is. It is better to be disappointed and worried in such a way now than to have her nerve broken. The doctors were quite right to insist on her being kept out of this dreadful business. I must be firm, for on me this particular burden of silence must rest. I shall never, ever enter into subject with her under any circumstances. Indeed, it may not be a hard task at all, for she herself has become reticent on the subject, and has not spoken of the Count or his doings ever since we told her of our decision. She really should have, honestly. 2nd October, evening. A long and trying and exciting day. By the first post I got, my directed envelope was a dirty scrap of paper enclosed, on which was written with a carpenter's pencil in a sprawling hand, "Sam Bloxham, Corcoran's 4, Potter's Court, Bartle Street, Walworth. Arsk for the despite." I got the letter in bed, and rose without waking Mina. She looked heavy and sleepy and pale, and far from well. I determined not to wake her, but that, when I should return from this new search, I would arrange for her going back to Exeter. I think she would be happier in her own home, with her daily tasks interest her, than being here amongst us and in ignorance. I only saw Dr. Seward for a moment, and told him where I was off to, promising to come back and tell the rest too. So soon I should have found anything. I drove to Walworth, and found, with some difficulty, Potter's Court. Mr. Spollett's spelling misled me, as I asked for Potter's Court instead of for Potter's Court. Potter's Court. Yeah. However, when I had found the court, I had no difficulty in discovering Corcoran's lodging house. When I asked the man who came in the door for the despite, he shook his head and said, "I don't know him. There ain't no such person here. I never heard of him in my own bloomin' days. Don't believe there ain't nobody here that livin' here in anywheres. I took out Smollett's letter, and as I read it seemed to be the lesson of my spelling of the name, and the court might guide me. What are you? I asked. I'm the deputy, he answered. I saw at once I was on the right track. Phonetic spelling had again misled me. A half-crown tip put the deputy's knowledge at my disposal, and I learned that Mr. Bloxam, who had slept off the remains of his beer in the previous night at Cochrane's, had left for his works at the Poplar at 5 o'clock that morning. He could not tell me where the place of work situated, but he had a vague idea that it was some kind of new-fangled warehouse. And with a slender clue, I had to start for Poplar. It was 12 o'clock when I got a satisfactory hint of the building, and thus I got at a coffee shop, where some workmen were having their dinner. One of these suggested that there was being erected at Cross Angel Street a new cold storage building, and this was suited the condition of the newfangled warehouse. As I drove to it, an interview with a surly gatekeeper and a surlier foreman, both of whom were appeased with coin of their own, put me on the track of Bloxam. He was sent for on my suggesting that I was willing to pay for his day's wages to the foreman for the privilege of asking him a few questions on a private matter. He was a smart enough fellow, though rough in speech and bearing. When I had promised to pay for his information and had given him an earnest, he told me that he made 2 journeys between Carfax and a house in Piccadilly, and had taken from this house to the latter 9 great boxes, main heavy ones, with a horse and cart hired by him for his purpose. I asked him if he could tell me the number of the house in Piccadilly, to which he replied, "Well, governor, I forgets the number. We're only a few doors from the big white church or something of that kind, not long built. It was a dusty old house, too, though nothing from the dustiness of our house we looked the bloomin' foxes from." "How did you get into the houses if they were both empty?" "There was an old party what engaged me a waiting at the house of Purfleet. He helped me to lift the boxes and put them in for the dray. Curse me, but he was the strongest chap I ever struck, and him an old fellow with a white moustache, one of them thin ones you could think of you couldn't throw a shot at." How this phrase thrilled through me. "Why, he looked up his end of the boxes like they were pounds of tea, and me a puffin' and a blowin' before I could even upend mine anyhow. And I'm no chicken neither." "How did you get into the house in Piccadilly?" I asked. "He was there too. I must have started off and got there before me, for when I rung the bell and kept him the door answering, he answered himself, helping me to carry the boxes into the hall." "The whole 9?" I asked. "Yes, there was 5 in the first load and 4 in the second. It was main dry work, and I don't do so well to remember how I got home." I interrupted him. "Were the boxes left in the hall?" "Yes, it was a big hole, and there ain't nothing else in it. I made one more attempt to further matters. You didn't have any key?" "Never used no key, no think. The old gent who opened the door himself and shut it again as I drove off. I don't remember the last time, but that was the beer." "And you can't remember the number of the house?" "Oh, sir, but you needn't have no difficulty about that. It's a high up one, with a stone front and a bow on it, and I steps up to the door. I know them steps. I haven't had carried the boxes up with 3 loafers and come down with a copper. The old gent gave me a shilling, and they got so much, they wanted more, but he took 'em one by one himself, and it was like throw 'em down the steps. A lot of them went away cussin'." I thought that this description I could find the house. So, paying my friend for his information, I started off to Piccadilly. I gained a few painful experience. The Count could, it was evident, handle the earth boxes himself. If so, time was precious, for now he had achieved a certain amount of distribution. He could, by any choosing of his own time, complete the task unobserved. At Piccadilly Circus, I discharged my cab and walked westward towards the Junior Constitutional. I came across the house described, and was satisfied that this was the house next of the layers arranged by Dracula. The house looked as though it had been long unattended. The windows were encrusted with dust, and the shutters were up, and the framework was black with time, and from the iron the paint had mostly scaled away. It was evident that up to lately there had been a large notice board on the front of the balcony. It had, however, been roughly torn away. The uprights which were supporting it still remaining. Behind the rails of the balcony I saw that there were some loose boards, whose raw edges looked white. I would have given a great deal to have been able to notice the board intact, as it would, perhaps, have given some clue to the ownership of the house. I remembered my experience from the investigation and purchase of Carfax, and I could not but feel that if I could have the former owner there might be some means of gaining access to the house. There was at present nothing to be learned from the Piccadilly side, and nothing could be done, so I went around the back to see if anything could be gathered from this quarter. The mews were active, the Piccadilly houses being mostly in occupation. I asked one or two of the grooms and helpers who I saw around if they could help me with anything about the empty houses. One of them said he had heard it had been taken already, but he couldn't say from whom. He told me, however, that it was very lately that there had been a notice board for the for sale sign up, and that perhaps Mitchell, Sons and Candy, the house agents, could tell me something, as he thought he remembered seeing the name of the firm on the board. I could not wish to seem too eager, or to let my informants know or guess too much, so thanking him in the usual manner, I strolled away. It was now growing dusk, and the autumn night was closing in, so I did not lose any time. Having learned the address of Mitchell, Sons and Candy from the directory of the Berkeley, I was soon at their office on Sackville Street. Sackville Bagginses. The gentleman who saw me was particularly suave in manner, but uncommunicative in equal proportion. Having once told me that he and the Piccadilly house, which throughout our interview he called a mansion, was sold, he considered my business as concluded. When I asked who purchased it, he opened his eyes and thought wider. He paused a few seconds before replying. "It is sold, sir." "Pardon me," I said with equal politeness, "but I have a special reason for wishing to know who purchased it." Again he paused longer, raised his eyebrow still more. "It is sold, sir." And again his laconic reply. "Surely," I said, "you do not mind letting me know so much?" "But I do mind," he answered. "The affairs of our clients are absolutely safe in the hands of Mitchell, Sons and Candy." This was manifestly a prig of the first water, and there was no use arguing with him. I thought it best to meet him on his own ground, so I said, "Your clients, sir, are unhappy in having the resolute guardian of their confidence, and I myself am a professional man." Here I handed him my card. "In this instance, I am not prompted by curiosity. I act in part of Lord Godalming, who wishes to know something of the property which was, he understood, lately for sale." These words put a different complexion on affairs, he said. "I would like to oblige you if I could, Mr. Harker, and especially would I like to oblige his lordship. We once carried out a small matter, renting some chambers for him when he was Honourable Arthur Holmeswood. If you will let me have his lordship's address, I will consult the house on the matter, and will in any case communicate with his lordship by tonight's post. It will be a pleasure if we can so far deviate from our rules to give the required information to his lordship. I wanted to secure a friend and not to make an enemy, so I thanked him and gave the address at Dr. Seward's and came away. It was now dark, and I was tired and hungry. I got a cup of tea from the Aerated Bread Company and came down to Purfleet by the next train. I found all the others at home. Mina was looking tired and pale, but she made a gallant effort to be bright and cheerful. It wrung my heart to think that I had to keep anything from her, and caused her through disquietude. Thank God this will be the last night for her looking at our conferences and feeling the sting of our not showing our confidence. It took all my courage to hold to the wise resolution of keeping her out of our grim task. She seemed somehow more recoiled, or else the subject seemed to be very repugnant to her. For when my accidental allusion made her, she actually shuddered. And I am glad we made our resolution in time, as with such a feeling as our own growing knowledge would be torture to her. I could not tell the others of my day's discovery till we were alone, so after dinner, followed by a little music to save appearances of even amongst ourselves, I took Mina to her room and let her go to bed. The dear girl was more affectionate with me than ever. She clung to me as though she would detain me, but there was much to be talked about, and as I came away, thank God, the ceasing of telling things made no difference between us. When I came down again, I found the others all gathered around the fire in the study. In the train, I had written my diary so far, and simply read it off to them as the best means of letting them get abreast of my own information. When I had finished, Van Helsing said, "This has been a great day's work, friend Jonathan. Doubtless we are on the track of the missing boxes. If we find all in that house, then our work is near the end. But if there be some missing, we must search until we find them. Then shall we make our final coup, and hunt the wretch to his real death." We all sat silent a while, and all at once Mr. Morris spoke up. "Say, how are we going to get into that house?" "We got into the other," answered Lord Goldring quite quickly. "But Art, this is different. We broke house at Carfax, but we had the night in Walled Park to protect us. It will be a mighty different thing to commit burglary in Piccadilly, either by day or night. I confess I don't see how we are going to get in unless the agency duck can find us some key of sort. Perhaps we shall know when we get his letter to the morning." Lord Godalming's brows contracted, and he stood up and walked about the room. By and by he stopped and said, turning from us one to another, "Quincy's head is level, but burglary business is getting serious. We got off once all right, but we now have a rare job in hand, unless we can find the Count's key basket." As nothing could well be done before morning, and as it would be less advisable to wait until Lord Godalming's should hear from Mitchell's, we decided not to make any active step before breakfast time. For a good while we sat and smoked, discussing the matter of the various things. I took an opportunity of bringing this diary right up to the moment. I'm very sleepy, and I shall go to bed. Just a line. Mina sleeps soundly, and her breathing is regular. Her forehead is puckered up into little wrinkles, as though she thinks even in her sleep. She is still too pale, but does not look so haggard as she did this morning. Tomorrow will, I hope, mend all this. She will be herself at home in Exeter. Oh, but I am sleepy. Dr. Seward's Diary. 1st October. I am puzzled about Renfield. His mood changes so rapidly that I find it difficult to keep touch with him, and as they always mean something more than his own well-being, I form more than interesting study. This morning, when I went to see him after his repulsive doctor in Helsing, his manner was that of a man commanding destiny. He was, in fact, commanding destiny, subjectively. He did not really care for any of the things of mere health. He was in the clouds and looked down on all the weaknesses and wants of us poor mortals. I thought I would improve the occasion and learn something. So I asked him, "What about the flies these times?" He smiled on me in quite a severe sort of way, such a smile as would become the face of Malvolio. And he answered me,
A fly, my dear sir, has one striking feature. Its wings are typical of aerial powers of the psychic facilities. The ancients did well when they simplified the soul as a butterfly.
I thought I would push this analogy to its almost logical. So, I said quickly, "Oh, it is the soul you're after now, is it?" His madness foiled his reason, and a puzzled look spread over his face as shaking his head with a decision which I had but seldom seen him. He said,
Oh no, oh no. I want no souls. Life is all I want.
Here he brightened up.
I am pretty indifferent about at the present. Life is all right. I have all I want. You must get a new patient, doctor, if you wish to study zoophagy.
This puzzled me a little, so I drew him on. "When you command life, are you God, I suppose?" He smiled with an effably benign superiority.
Oh no, far be it from me to aggregate myself to the attributes of a deity. I am not even concerned his life, especially doing things. If I may state my intellectual position, I am, so far it concerns as things purely terrestrial, somewhat in the position of an epoch, studied spirituality.
This was a poser to me. I could not for the moment recall Enoch's positiveness, so I had to ask simple questions, though I felt that day I was lowering myself in the eyes of a lunatic. "And why Enoch?"
Because he walked with God.
I could not see the analogy, but did not like to admit it, so I harked back to that he had denied. "So you don't care about life, and you don't want souls. Why not?" I put my question quickly and somewhat sternly, on purpose to disconcert him. The effort succeeded. For an instant he unconsciously relapsed into his old servile manner, bent low before me, and actually fawned upon me as he replied,
I don't want any souls, indeed, indeed. I don't. I couldn't use them if I had them. They would be no manner of use to me. I couldn't eat them or...
He stopped suddenly, and the old cunning look spread over his face, like a wind sweep on the surface of the water.
Doctor, as to life, what is it after all? When you've got all you require, and you know you want you'll never have, that is all. I have friends, good friends, like you, Dr. Seward.
He said with a leer of inexpressible cunning.
I know that I shall never lack the means of life.
I think that through the cloudiness of his insanity he saw some antagonism in me, for he at once fell back on the last refuge of such as he, a dogged silence. After a short time I saw that for the present it was useless to speak to him. He was sulky, so I came away. Later in the day he sent for me. Ordinarily I would not come without special reason, but just at present I am so interested in him that I would gladly make an effort. Besides, I'm glad to have anything to do to help me pass the time. Harker's out looking for clues, And so are Lord Godalming and Quincy. Van Helsing sits in my study, poring over the record samples by the Harkers. He seems to think that by accurate knowledge of the details he will light upon some clue. He does not wish to be disturbed in the work without cause. I would have taken him with me to see the patient, only I thought that after his last repulse he might not care to go again. There was also another reason. Renfield might not speak so freely before a third person as when he and I were alone. I found him sitting in the middle of the floor on a stool, a pose which is generally indicative of some mental energy on his part. When I came in, he said at once, as though the question had been waiting on his lips,
What are souls?
It was evident that when my surmise had been correct, unconscious cerebration was doing its work, even with the lunatic. I determined to have the matter out. What about them yourself? I asked. He did not reply for a moment, but looked all around him, and up and down, as though he expected to find some inspiration for the answer.
I don't want any souls, he said in a feeble, apologetic way.
The matter seemed preying on his mind, and so I determined to use it. To be cruel, only to be kind. So said I. You like life, and you want life.
Oh, yes, but that is all right. You needn't worry about that.
But, I asked, how are we to get the life without getting the soul also? This seemed to puzzle him, and so I followed up. The last time you'll have some time when you're fleeing out of here, with the souls of 1,000 flies and spiders and birds and cats buzzing and twittering and meowing all around you. You've got their lives, you know, and you must put up with their souls. Something seemed to affect his imagination, for he put his fingers to his ears and shut his eyes, screwing them up tightly as a small boy does when his face is being soaped. There was something pathetic in that touched me. It also gave me a lesson, for it seemed that before me was a child. Only a child. Though his features were worn and the stubble on his jaws was white, it was evident that he was undergoing some process of mental disturbance, and knowing how his past moods had interpreted things seemingly foreign to him, I thought I would enter into his mind as well as I could and go with him. The first step was to restore confidence, so I asked him, speaking pretty loud so that he could hear me through his closed fingers. Would you like some sugar to get your flies around again? He seemed to wake all at once and shook his head. With a laugh, he replied,
Not much. Flies are poor things after all.
After a pause, he added,
But I don't want their souls buzzing around me all the time.
or spiders, I went on.
Blow spiders. What's the use of spiders? There isn't anything in them to eat or...
He stopped suddenly, as though reminded of a forbidden topic. So, I thought to myself. This is the second time he has suddenly stopped at the word drink. What does it mean? Renfield seemed himself aware of having made a lapse, for he hurried on as though he'd distract my attention from it.
I don't take any stock in all the such matters. Rats and mice and such and small deer, as Shakespeare has it. Chicken feed for the larder, it might be called. I'm past all sort of nonsense. You might as well ask me to eat molecules with a pair of chopsticks as to try to interest me in lesser carnivora when I know of what I'm being before me.
I see, I said. You want big things that can make your teeth meet in it. How would you like to breakfast on an elephant?
What ridiculous nonsense are you talking?
He was getting too wide awake. so I thought I would press him hard. I wonder, I said reflectively, what an elephant's soul is like. The effect I desired was obtained, for at once he fell on his high horse and began a child again.
I don't want an elephant's soul, or any soul at all, he said.
For a few moments he sat despondently. Suddenly he jumped to his feet, and with his eyes blazing and all signs of intense cerebral excitement,
To hell with you and all your souls,
he shouted.
Why do you plague me about souls? Haven't I got enough to worry and pain and distract me already without thinking of souls?
He looked so hostile that I thought he was in another of his homicidal fits, so I blew my whistle. The instant, however, that I did so, he became calm and said apologetically,
Forgive me, Doctor. I forgot myself. You do not need any help. I am so worried in my mind that I am apt to be irritable. If you only knew the problem I have to face, and that I am working out, you would pity, and tolerate, and pardon me. Pray do not put me in a strait waistcoat. I want to think, and I cannot think freely when my body is confined. I am sure you will understand.
He had evidently self-control, so when the attendants came in I told them not to mind, and they withdrew. Renfield watched them go, and when the door was closed he said, with considerable dignity and sweetness,
Dr. Seward, you have been very considerate towards me. Believe me that I am very, very grateful to you.
I thought it well to leave him in this mood, and so I came away. There is certainly something to ponder over in this man's state. Several points seem to make what the American interviewer called a story. If only one could get them in the proper order. Here they are. Will not mention drinking. Fears the thought of being burdened with the souls of anything. Has no dread of wanting life in the future. Despite the meaner forms of life altogether, though he dreads being haunted by their souls. Logically, all these things point one way. He has assurance of some kind that he will acquire some higher life. He dreads the consequence and burden of a soul. Then it is a human life he looks to. And the assurance? Merciful God, the Count has been to him, and there is some new scheme of terror afoot. Later, I went after my round to Van Helsing and told him my suspicion. He grew very grave, and after thinking the matter over for a while, asked me to take him to Renfield. I did so. As we came to the door, we heard a lunatic within singing gaily, as he used to do in the time which now seems so long ago. When we entered, we saw with the amazement that he had spread out his sugar as of old. The flies, lethargic with the autumn, were beginning to buzz around the room. We tried to make him talk of the subject of our previous conversation, but he would not attend. We went on with the singing, just as though we had not even been present. He had a scrap of paper and was folding it into a notebook. We had to come away as ignorant as we went in. His is a ludicrous, curious case indeed. We must watch him tonight. Letter. Mitchell, Sons and Candy to Lord Godalming. October 1st. My lord, we are at all times only too happy to meet your wishes. We beg with regard to the desire of your lordship expressed by Mr. Harker on your behalf, to supply the following information concerning the sale and purchase of number 347 Piccadilly. The original vendors are the executors of the late Mr. Archibald Suffield. The purchaser is a foreign nobleman, Count de Ville, who effected the purchase himself, paying the purchase money in notes over the counter. If your lordship will pardon us for being so vulgar in expression, Beyond this, we know nothing whatsoever of him. We are, my lord, your lord's humble servants. Mitchell, Sons and Candy. Dr. Seward's Diary, 2nd October. I placed a man on the corridor last night and told him to make an accurate note of any sound he might hear from Renfield's room, and gave him instructions that if there should be anything strange he was to call me. After dinner, when we had all gathered around the fire in the study, Mrs. Harker having gone to bed, we discussed the attempts and discoveries of the day. Harker was the only one who had any result, and we are in great hopes that his clue may be an important one. Before going to bed, I went around to the patient's room and looked through the observation trap. He was sleeping soundly, and his chest rose and fell with regular respiration. This morning the man on duty reported to me that a little after midnight he was restless and kept saying his prayers somewhat loudly. I asked him if that was all. He replied that it was all he heard. There was something in his manner so suspicious that I asked him point blank if he had been asleep. He denied sleep, but admitted to having dozed for a while. It was too bad that men cannot be trusted unless they are watched. Today Harker is out following up on his clue, and Art and Quincy are looking after horses. Guttlering thinks that it will be well to have horses always in readiness, for when we get to the information which we seek, there will be no time to lose. We must sterilize all the imported earth between sunrise and sunset. We shall thus catch the Count at his weakest, and without refuge to fly to. Van Helsing is off to the British Museum, looking up the authorities of ancient medicine. The old physicians took account of things which their followers did not accept, and the professor is searching for witch and demon cures which might be useful later. I sometimes think we all must be mad, and that we have waked the sanity in straight waistcoats. Later. We have met again. We seem to at last be on track, and our work tomorrow may be the beginning of the end. I wonder if Renfield's quiet has anything to do with this. His moods have so followed the doings of the Count that the coming destruction of the monster may be carried to him in some subtle way. If we could only get some hint as to what passed in his mind between the time of my argument with him yesterday and his resumption of the fly-catching, it might afford us some valuable clue. He is now seemingly quiet for a spell. Is he? That wild yell seemed to come from his room. The attendant came bursting into my room and told me that Renfield had somehow met with some accident. He had heard him yell, and when he came to him, he found him lying on face on the floor, all covered with blood. I must go at once. Chapter 21. Dr. Seward's Journal. 3rd October. Let me put this down with exactness, all that happened, as well as I can remember, since I made my last entry. Not a detail that I can recall must be forgotten. In all calmness, I must proceed. When I came to Renfield's room, I found him lying on the floor, on his left side, in a glittering pool of blood. When I went to remove him, it became at once apparent that he had received some terrible injuries. There seemed none of that unity of purpose between the parts of the body which marks even lethargic sanity. As the face was exposed, I could see that it was horribly bruised, as though it had been beaten against the floor. Indeed, it was from the face wounds that the pool of blood originated. The attendant who was kneeling beside the body said to me as we turned him over, "I think, sir, his back is broken. See, both his right arm and leg and the whole side of his face are paralyzed." How such a thing could have happened puzzled the attendant beyond measure. He seemed quite bewildered, and his brows were gathered in as he said, "I can understand the two things. He could mark his face like that by beating his own head on the ground.
I saw a young woman do it once at the Eversfield Asylum before anyone could lay hands on her. And I suppose he might have broke his back by falling off the bed, if he got in an awkward kink. But for the life of me, I can't imagine how the two things occurred. If his back was broke, he couldn't have beat his head and his face was like that before the fall on the bed. There would be marks of it, I said to him. Go to Dr. Van Helsing and ask him kindly to come here at once. I want him without an instant's delay. The man ran off, and within a very few minutes the professor, in his dressing gown and slippers, appeared. When he saw Renfield on the ground, he looked keenly at him. A moment, then he turned to me. I think he recognized my thought in his eyes, for he said very quietly, manifestly for the ears of the attendant, "Ah, a sad accident. He will need very careful watching and much attention. I shall stay with you myself, but I shall first dress myself. If you will remain, I shall be in a few moments to join you." The patient was now breathing stertorously, and it was easy to see that he had suffered some terrible injury. Van Helsing returned with an extraordinary sterility, bearing with him a surgical case. He had evidently been thinking and had his mind made up, for almost before he looked at the patient, he whispered to me, "Send the attendant away. We must be alone with him when he becomes conscious after the operation." So I said, "I think that will do now, Stemmons. We have done all we can at the present. You had better go to your round. Dr. Van Helsing will operate. Let me know instantly if there is anything unusual anywhere." The man withdrew, and we went into a strict examination of the patient. The wounds of the face were superficial. The real injury was a depressed fracture of the skull, extending right up through the motor area. The professor thought a moment and said, "We must reduce the pressure to get back to normal conditions, as far as can be. The rapidity of our suffusion shows the terrible nature of his injury. The whole motor area seems affected. The suffusion of the brain will increase quickly, so we must trephine at once, or it will be too late." As he was speaking, there was a soft tapping at the door. I went over and opened it, and found it was the corridor without. Arthur and Quincy in pajamas and slippers. The former spoke. "I heard your man call up Dr. Van Helsing and told him of an accident. So woke Quincy, or rather called for him, as he was not asleep. Things are moving too quickly and too strangely for sound sleep in any of these times. I've been thinking that tomorrow night we shall see things as they have been. We'll have to go look back and forward a little more than we have done. May we come in?" I nodded and held the door open a little till they had entered, then I closed it. When Quincy saw the attitude and state of the patient, and noted the terrible pool of blood on the floor, he said softly, "Oh, God, what has happened to him? Poor devil." I told him briefly, and added that we expected he would recover consciousness after the operation, for a short time at all events. He went at once and sat down on the edge of the bed, with Godalming beside him. We all watched in patience. "We shall wait," said Van Helsing, "just long enough to fix the best spots for subterfuge, so that we may quickly and perfectly remove the blood clot, for it is evident that the hemorrhage is increasing." The minutes during which we waited passed in fearful slowness. I had a horrible feeling sinking in my heart, and from Van Helsing's face I gathered that he felt some fear or apprehension as to what was to come. I dreaded the words that Renfield might speak. I was positively afraid to think, but the conviction of what was coming was on me.
as I have read of men who had heard such a death watch. Poor man's breathing came in uncertain gasps. Each instant he seemed as though he would open his eyes and speak, but then would follow a prolonged strenuous breath, and he would relapse into a more fixed insensibility. I turned as I was to sick beds and death. The suspense grew and grew upon me. I could almost hear the beating of my own heart. The blood surging through my temples sounded like flows from a hammer. The silence became agonizing. I looked at my companions, one after another, and saw from their flushed faces and damp brows that they were equally enduring torture. There was a nervous suspense over all of us, as though overhead some dread bell would peal out powerfully when least expected. At last there came a time when it was evident that the patient was sinking fast. He might die at any moment. I looked up at the Professor and caught his eyes fixed on mine. His face was sternly set as he spoke.
There is no time to lose. His words may be worth many lives. I have been thinking so as I stood here. It may be there is a soul at stake. We shall operate just above the ear.
Without another word, he made the operation. For a few moments, my breathing continued to be stertorous. Then there came a breath so prolonged that it seemed as though it would tear open his chest. Suddenly his eyes opened, and became fixed in a wild, hopeless stare. This was continued for a few moments, then it softened into a glad surprise, and from the lips came a sigh of relief. He moved convulsively, and as he did so said,
I will be quiet, Doctor. Tell them to take off the straight waistcoat. I have had a terrible dream, and it has left me so weak that I cannot move. What's wrong with my face? It feels all swollen, and it smarts dreadfully.
He tried to turn his head, but even with all the effort his eyes seemed to grow glassy again, so I gently put it back. Then Van Helsing said, in a quiet, grave tone,
Tell us your dream, Mr. Renfield.
As he heard the voice, his face brightened through its mutilation, and said,
That is Dr. Van Helsing. How good it is to have you here. Give me some water. My lips are dry, and I shall tell you. I dreamed.
He stopped and seemed fainting. I called to Quincy. The brandy, it's in my study, quick. He flew and returned with a glass, the decanter of brandy, and a carafe of water. We moistened the parched lips, and the patient lay quickly revived. It seemed, however, that his poor injured brain had been working in the interval, for when he was quite conscious he looked at me piercingly with an agonized confusion which I shall never forget, and said,
I must not deceive myself. It was no dream, but all grim reality.
Then his eyes moved round the room, as they caught sight of two figures sitting patiently on the edge of the bed as he went on.
If you were not sure already, I should know from them.
For an instant his eyes closed, not with the pain of sleep or voluntarily, as though he were bringing all his faculties to bear. When he opened them, he said, hurriedly, and with more energy than he had yet displayed,
Quick, doctor, I am dying. I feel that I have but a few minutes and I must go forth back to death, or worse. Wet my lips with brandy again. I have something that I must say before I die. Or before my poor soul is crushed and my brain dies anyhow. Thank you. It was that night after you left me, when I was imploring you to let me go away. I couldn't speak then, for I felt my tongue was tied. But I was as sane then, except in the way that I am now. I was in an agony of despair for a long time after you left me. It seemed hours. Then there came a sudden peace at once. My brain seemed to begin cool again, and I realized where I was. I heard dogs bark behind the house, but not where he was.
As he spoke, Van Helsing's eyes never blinked, but his hand came out and met mine and gripped it hard. He did not, however, betray himself. He nodded slightly and said, "Go on," in a low voice. Redfield proceeded.
He came up to the window in the mist, as I had seen him often before, but he was solid then, not his ghost. His eyes were fierce like a man's when angry. He was laughing with his red mouth. The sharp white teeth glinted in the moonlight when he turned to look back at the belt of trees where the dogs were barking. I wouldn't ask him to come in at first, though I knew he wanted to, just as he had wanted all along. Then he began promising things, not in words, but by doing them.
He was interrupted by a word of the professor. "How?"
By making them happen, just as he used to send the flies when the sun was shining. Great big fat ones with steel and sapphire on their wings, and big moths in the night with skull and crossbones on their backs.
Van Helsing nodded to him as he whispered to me unconsciously.
The Acrotha apatros of the Sphinxes. What's that called? The death's head moth.
The patient went on without stopping.
Then he began to whisper. Rats, rats, rats. Hundreds, thousands, millions of them. And every one alive. The dogs eat them. And cats too. All lives. All red blood. With years of life in it. And not merely buzzing flies. I laughed at him, for I wanted to see what he could do. Then the dogs howled away beyond the dark trees of his house. He beckoned me at the window. I got up and looked out, and he raised his hands and seemed to call out without using any words. A dark mass spread over the grass, coming at like a shape of flame of fire. Then he moved the mist to the right and the left, and I could see that there were thousands of rats with red blazing eyes, like his, only smaller. He held up his hand, and they all stopped, and I thought he seemed to be saying, All these lives will I give you, I and many more and greater, through countless ages, if you will come fall down and worship me. And then a red cloud like the color of blood seemed to close over my eyes, and before I knew what was coming, I found myself opening the sash and saying to him, Come in, Lord and Master. The rats were all gone, but he slid into the room through the sash, though it was hardly open an inch wide, just as the moon herself has often come into the tiniest cracks, and he stood before me in all her size and splendor.
His voice was weaker, so I moistened his lips with the brandy again, and he continued, but it seemed as though his memory had gone to working in the interval, for his story was further advanced. I was about to call him back to the point, but Van Helsing whispered to me,
Let him go on. Do not interrupt him. He cannot go back, and maybe could not proceed at all at once, and he lost his thread of thought.
He proceeded.
All day I wanted to hear from him, but he did not send me anything, not even a blowfly, and when the moon got up I was pretty angry with him. When he slid through the window, though it was shut, he did not even knock. I got mad at him. He stared at me, and his white face looked at the mist with his red eyes gleaming. And he went on as though he owned the whole place, and I was no one. He didn't even smell the same as he did when he went by me. I couldn't hold him. I thought that somehow Mrs. Harker had come into the room.
The two men sitting on the bed stood up and came over, standing behind him so that he could not see them. But where they were, they could hear better. They both were silent, but the professor started and quivered. His face, however, grew dimmer and sterner still. Renfield went on without noticing.
When Mrs. Harker came in to see me this afternoon, she wasn't the same. It was like tea after a teapot had been watered.
How we all moved, but not one sound, he went on.
I didn't know that she was here till she spoke, and she didn't look the same. I don't care for the pale people. I like them with lots of blood in them, and hers all seemed to have run out. I didn't think of it at the time, but when she went away I began to think, and it made me sad to know that he had been taking the life out of her.
I could feel that the rest quivered as I did, but remained otherwise still.
So when he had came tonight I was ready for him. I saw the mist stealing up, and I grabbed it tight. Then I heard the madmen have unnatural strength, and I knew that I was a madman, at times anyhow. I resolved to use my power, and he felt it too, for he had to come out of the mist to struggle with me. I held tight, and I thought I was going to win, for I didn't mean him to take any more of her life, till I saw his eyes. They burned into me, and my strength became like water. He slipped through, and when I tried to cling to him, he raised me up and flung me down. Then a red cloud before me, and a noise like thunder, and the mist seemed to steal away under the door. His voice was becoming fainter, and his breath more stertorous.
Van Helsing stood up instinctively.
"We know the worst now," he said. Here, here he is here, and we know his purpose. It may not be too late. Let us be armed, the same we were the other night. But lose no time. There is not an instant to spare.
There was no need to put our fear, nay, our conviction into words. We shared them in common. We all hurried and took to our rooms the same things entered the we had when we entered the Count's house. The professor had his ready as we met the corridor and pointed to them significantly and said,
They never leave me, and shall not till this unhappy business is over. Be wise also, my friends, for it is no common enemy that we deal with. Alas, alas, as I fear dear Madam Mina should suffer.
He stopped. His voice was breaking. I do not know if rage or terror predominated in my own heart. Outside the Harker's door, we paused. Art and Quincy held back, and the latter said, Should we disturb her?
We must, said Van Helsing grimly. If the door be locked, I shall break it in.
May it not frighten her terribly. The usual break into a lady's room, Van Helsing said solemnly.
You are always right. In this life and death, all chambers are alike to the doctor, and even were they not, they are all to be as one this night. Friend John, when I turn the handle, if the door does not open, do you put your shoulder down and shove, and you too, my friends, now.
He turned the handle as we spoke. The door did not yield. We threw ourselves against it. With a crash, it burst open. We almost fell headlong into the room. The professor did actually fall, and he saw across him as he gathered himself up to his hands and knees. What I saw appalled me. I felt the hair rise like bristles on the back of my neck. My heart seemed to stand still. The moonlight was so bright, through that thick yellow blind of the room was light enough to see. On the bed beside the window lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed, and breathing heavily as though in stupor. Kneeling on the near edge of the bed, facing outwards, was the white-clad figure of his wife. By her stood a tall, thin man, clad in black. His face was turned from us, but the instant we saw him we all recognized the Count. In every way, even to the scar on his forehead. With his left hand, he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away from her with his arms full of tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by the torn open dress. The attitude of which the two was a terrible resemblance of a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. As we burst into the room, the Count turned his face, and the hellish look that I had heard described seemed to leap unto it.
His eyes flamed red with a devilish passion. The great nostrils of his white, aquiline nose opened wide and quivered at the edge, and the sharp white teeth behind the full lips of blood-dripping mouth clamped together like those of a wild beast. With a wrench which threw his victim back onto the bed as though hurled from a height, he turned and sprang at us. But by this time the professor had gained his feet and was holding towards him the envelope which contained the sacred water. The count suddenly stopped, just as poor Lucy had done outside the tomb, and cowered back. Further and further back he cowered as we, lifting our crucifixes, advanced. The moonlight suddenly failed, as a great black cloud sailed across the sky, and when the gaslight sprang up under Quincy's match, we saw nothing but a faint vapor. This, as we looked, trailed under the door, which, with the recoil of its bursting open, had swung back into its old position. Van Helsing, Art, and I moved towards Mrs. Harker, who by this time had drawn her breath, and with it had given a scream so wild, so ear-piercing, so despairing, that it seems to be now that will ever be ringing in my ears till of my dying day. For a few seconds she lay in her helpless attitude in disarray. Her face was ghastly with a pallor which was accentuated by the blood which smeared her lips and cheeks and chin. From her throat trickled a thin stream of blood. Her eyes were mad with terror. Then she put before her face her poor crushed hands, which bore on her the whiteness of the red mark of the Count's terrible grip. And from behind them came a low, desolate wail, which made the terrible scream seem only the quick exposition of an endless grief. Van Helsing stepped forward and drew the coverlet gently over her body, whilst Art, looking after her face an instant despairingly, ran out of the room. Van Helsing whispered to me, "Jonathan is in a stupor, as we know the vampire can produce. We can do nothing with poor Madam Mina for a few moments till she recovers herself. I must wake him." He dipped the end of the towel with cold water and began to fling him from the face, his wife all the while holding her face between her hands and sobbing in a way that was heartbreaking to hear. I raised the blind and looked out of the window. There was such moonshine, and as I looked I could see Quincy Morris racing across the lawn and hide himself in the shadow of a great yew tree. It puzzled me to think why he was doing this, but at the instant I heard Harker's quick explanation as he woke to partial consciousness and turned to the bed. On his face there might as well have been a look of wild amazement. He seemed dazed for a few seconds, and then full consciousness seemed to burst upon him all at once as he started up. His wife was aroused by the quick movements, and turned to him with her arms outstretched, though to embrace him. Instantly, however, she drew them in again, putting her elbows together, held her hands before her face, and shuddered till the bed beneath her shook. "God's name, what does this mean?" Harker cried out. "Dr. Seward, Dr. Van Helsing, what is it? What has happened? What is wrong? Mina, dear, what is it? What does the blood mean? My God, has it come to this?" And raising himself to his knees, and beat his hands wildly together. "Good God, help us! Help her! Help her!" With a quick movement he jumped from the bed and began to pull on his clothes, all the man in him awake to the need of instant excursion. "What has happened? Tell me about it," he cried without pausing. "Dr. Van Helsing, you love Mina, I know. Oh, do something to save her. She cannot have gone too far yet. Guard her while I look for him." His wife, through her terror and horror and distress, saw some sure danger to him, and instantly forgetting her own grief, seized hold of him and cried out, "No, no, Jonathan, you must not leave me. I have suffered enough tonight, God knows, without the dread of this harming you. You must stay with me. Stay with these friends who will watch over you." Her expression became frantic as she spoke, and as he yielded to her, she pulled him down, sitting beside the bed, and clung to him fiercely.
Van Helsing and I tried to calm them both. The professor held up his little crucifix and said with wonderful calmness,
"Do not fear, my dear. We are here, and whilst this is close to you, no foul thing can approach. You are safe for tonight, and we must be calm and take counsel together."
She shuddered and was silent, holding down her head to her husband's breast. When she raised up, the white nightrobe was stained with blood where her lips had touched, and where the thin open wound of her neck had sent forth drops. The instant she saw it, she drew back with a low wail and whispered amidst choking sobs,
"Unclean, unclean! I must touch him or kiss him no more. Oh, that is, should that it be so, I am now my own worst enemy, and whom may I have most fear?"
To this he spoke out resolutely.
"Nonsense, Mina. It is shame to hear such a word. I would not hear it from you. I shall not hear it from you. May God judge me by my own deserts, and punish me with more bitter suffering than this, even this hour, if by any act or will mine anything ever become between us."
He put out his arm and folded her to his breast, and for a while she lay there sobbing. He looked at us over her bowed head, with eyes that dampened above the quivering nostrils. His mouth was set as steel. After a while her sobs became less frequent and more faint. And then she said to me, speaking with studied calmness which I felt tried this nervous power to the utmost.
"And now, Dr. Seward, tell me all about it. Too well I know the broad fact. Tell me all that has been."
I told him exactly what had happened, and he listened with seeming impassiveness. But his nostrils twitched and his eyes blazed as I told how the ruthless hands of the Count had held his wife in that terrible and horrid position, with her mouth to the open wound of his breast. It interested me, even at the moment, to see that whilst his face was white with passion, worked convulsively over the bowed head, his hands tenderly and lovingly stroked her ruffled hair. Just as I had finished, Quincy and Guttlering knocked at the door. They entered in obedience to our summons. Van Helsing looked at me questioningly. I understood him to mean that if we were to take advantage of their coming to divert, if possible, the thoughts of the unhappy husband and wife from each other, and from themselves. So, on my nodding acquaintance to him, he asked them what they had seen or done, to which Lord Godalming answered, "I could not see him anywhere in the passage or any of the rooms. I looked in the study, but though he had been there, he had gone. He had, however," he stopped suddenly, looking at the poor drooping figure on the bed. Van Helsing said gravely,
"Go on, friend Arthur. We want no more concealments. Our hope is now in knowing all. Tell freely."
So Art went on. He had been there, and though it could only be seen so far as a few seconds, he made rare hay of the place. All the manuscript had been burned, and the blue flames were flickering among the white ashes. The cylinders of your phonograph, too, were thrown in the fire, and the wax had helped the flames. Here I interrupted. Thank God there is another copy in the safe. His face lit for a moment, but fell again as he went on. I ran downstairs and could see no sign of him. I looked into Renfield's room, and there was no trace except... Again he paused. Go on, said Harker hoarsely. So he bowed his head, and moistening his lips with his tongue, he added, except the poor fellow is dead. Mrs. Harker raised her head, looking from one to the other of us, and said solemnly, God's will be done. I could not feel but Art had been keeping back something. But, as I took it as it was on purpose, I said nothing. Van Helsing turned to Morris and asked,
"And you, friend Quimby, have you any to tell?"
A little, he answered. It may be much eventually, but at present I can't say.
I thought it well to know the possible where the Count would have go if he left his house. I did not see him, but I saw a bat rise from Renfield's window and flap westward. I expected to see him in some shape go back to Carfax, but evidently he sought some other lair. He will not go back tonight, for the sky is reddening in the east, and John is close. We must work tomorrow. He said the latter words through his shut teeth. For a space of a couple of minutes there was silence, and I could fancy that I could hear the sound of our hearts beating. Then Van Helsing said, placing his hand very intently on Mina Harker's head, "And now, poor Mina, poor dear, dear Mina, tell us exactly what happened. God knows that I do not want that you be pained, but it is need that we know all. For now more than ever has all work got to be done with sharp and in deadly earnest. The day is close to us that this must all end, and if it be so, now is the chance we have to live and learn." The poor dear lady shivered, and I could see the tension in her nerves as she clasped her husband closer to her, and bent her head lower and lower till still on his breast. Then she raised her head proudly and held out one hand to Van Helsing, took it in his, and, after stooping and kissed it reverently, held it fast. The other hand was locked in that of her husband, who held his other arm thrown around her protectively. After a pause in which she was evidently ordering her thoughts, she began. "I took the sleeping draught which you had so kindly given me, but for a long time it did not act. It seemed to become more wakeful, and myriads of horrible fancies began to crowd in my mind, all of them connected with death, and vampires, with blood and pain and trouble." Her husband involuntarily groaned as she turned to him and said lovingly, "Do not fret, dear. You must be brave and strong, and help me through this horrible task. If you only knew what the effort was to me to tell this tearful thing, you would all understand how much I need your help. Well, I saw I must try to help the medicine in its work with my will." I'm getting the voices off here. If it was to do me any good, so I resolutely set myself to sleep. Sure enough, sleep must soon have come to me, for I remember no more. Jonathan coming in had not waked me, for he lay by my side when I next remember. There was in the room the same thin white mist that I had noticed before. But I forget now if you know of this. You will find it in my diary, which I shall show you later. I felt the same vague terror which had come to me before, and the same sense of some presence. I turned to wake Jonathan, but found that he slept so soundly that it seemed as if it was he who had taken the sleeping draught and not I. I tried, but I could not wake him. This caused me great fear, and I looked around terrified. Then indeed my heart sank beneath me, for he was on the bed as if he stepped out of the mist, or rather, if the mist had turned into his figure, for it had entirely disappeared, stood a tall man, thin man, in all black. I knew him at once from the descriptions of the others. The waxen face, the high aquiline nose, on which the light fell a thin white line, the parted red lips, with the sharp teeth showing between, and the red eyes that I had seemed to see in the sunset in the windows of St. Mary's Church at Whitby. I knew, too, the red scar on his forehead where Jonathan had struck him. For an instant my heart stood still, and I would have screamed out, only that I was paralyzed, and that he paused, spoke in some sort of keen, cutting whisper, pointing as he spoke to Jonathan. "Silence! If you make a sound, I shall take him and dash his brains out before your very eyes." I was appalled and was too bewildered to say anything. With a mocking smile, he placed one hand upon my shoulder and, holding me tight, bared my throat, the young saying, as he did so, "First a little refreshment to reward my excursions." You may as well be quiet. It is not the first time or the second that your veins have appeased my thirst. I was bewildered, and strangely enough, I did not want to hinder him. I suppose it isn't a part of the horrible curse that happens when his touch is on his victim. And oh, my God, pity me. This place is reeking lips on my throat. Her husband groaned again. She clasped the hand harder and looked at him pityingly, as if he were the injured one, and went on. I felt my strength fading away, and I was in a half swoon. How long this terrible thing lasted I know not, but it seemed that a long time must have passed before he took this foul, awful, sneering mouth away. I saw it drip with the fresh blood. The remembrance seemed for a while to overpower her, and she drooped and would have sunk down but for her husband's sustaining arm. With a great effort, she recovered herself and went on. Then he spoke to me mockingly. And so you, like the others, would play your brains against mine. You would have these men to hunt me and frustrate me in my designs. You know now, and they know in part already, and will know in full belong what it is to cross my path. They should have kept their energies for use closer to home, whilst they played wits against me who commanded nations and intrigued for them, and fought for them hundreds of years before they were born. I was countermining them. And you, their best beloved one, are now mine. Flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin, my beautiful winepress for a while, and shall be later on my companion and my helper. You shall be avenged in turn, for not one of them but shall minister to your needs. But yet you are to be punished for what you have done. You have aided and thwarted me. Now you shall come to my call. When my brand says come to you, you shall cross land or sea to do my bidding. And to end this, with that he pulled open his shirt. With his long, sharp nails opened a vein in his breast. When the blood began to spurt out, he took my hands in his, holding them tight, and with the other seized my neck and pressed my mouth to the wound, so that I must either suffocate or swallow some of the... Oh, my God, what have I done? What have I done to deserve such fate? I who have tried to walk in meekness and righteousness in my days. God, pity me. Look down on my poor soul in worse than mortal peril, and in mercy pity those to whom she is dear. Then she began. Then she began to rub her lips as though to cleanse them from pollution. She was telling her terrible story. The eastern sky began to quicken, and everything became more and more clear. Harker was still and quiet, but over his face, as an awful narrative went on, came the gray look which deepened and deepened in the morning light, till when the first red streak of the coming dawn shot up, the flesh stood darkly out against the whitening hair. We have arranged that one of us stay within call of the unhappy pair till we can meet together and arrange about some taking action. Of this I am sure. The sun rises today on no more miserable house in all the great round of its daily course.